Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NIH Blueprint Diversity Specialized Pre-Doc to Postdoc Advancement in Neuroscience, or the D-SPAN Award, which is the F99 K00 mechanism webinar. I'm your moderator today. My name is Lauren Ulrich, and I'm a Scientific Program Manager in the Office of Programs to Enhance Neuroscience Workforce Diversity at NINDS. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A box shown on the screen. You will be muted, so we won't be able to hear you, but we'll try to get to all of the questions that we can during the webinar. But if any of your questions are not answered, just email them to us, and we're happy to answer them directly. So today we're going to go through a few introductions, then we'll do a short overview of the D-SPAN program, and then we're going to hear from 4 awardees that currently have the D-SPAN award about their process for applying, and then we'll have our Q&A. So our speakers today are Dr. Michelle Jones-London, Chief of the Office of Programs to Enhance Neuroscience Workforce Diversity at NINDS, Dr. Nate Harnett, a postdoc fellow at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School, Dr. Nadia Khan, a postdoc fellow at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, Dr. Alberto Lopez, a postdoc fellow at Vanderbilt University, and Dr. Stephanie Noble, a postdoc associate at Yale University School of Medicine. So first up, we have Dr. Michelle Jones-London, who's going to give you a very brief overview of the F99 K00 mechanism.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. And so to start out, it's really important to note that although F99 K00 D-SPAN awards are held at NINDS, they are in fact a collaboration or a collaborative effort across 13 different NIH institutes that all have an interest in neuroscience, and collectively we call that group the NIH Blueprint. So it's important to know that as long as your research that you're proposing fits one of those Blueprint institutes, and you can see those institutes named below in the slide, then you're eligible to apply for the NIH Blueprint F99 K00. There's other eligibility criteria, but the science being foremost. It's also really good to keep in mind that other ICs now have F99 K00s, so you'll want to pay attention to the FOA number. That'll tell you what program you're actually applying to. You can't just go by the mechanism name alone. In terms of how the D-SPAN is structured for the F99 K00 award, it really is during that first 2 years when you have the F99 as a graduate student. You should have about 1 to 2 years to finish up your graduate work. And then once that is finished, and if you're a successful D-SPAN awardee, you would then have 4 years of the K00 to complete your postdoctoral fellowship. This award really, it goes, the F99 and the K00 goes hand in hand, and it's for those who have an interest in neuroscience research, but also the BRAIN initiative. If you're interested in that research area, you would be eligible to apply as well. In terms of other things that you'll want to check off before applying is that this program is intended for individuals from underrepresented groups in neuroscience. NIH just recently released a diversity policy statement, so you'll want to look at that notice to go through the eligible categories. But just for example, it includes racial, ethnic groups who are underrepresented in neuroscience, persons with disability, and now we recently have a very defined definition of those who would be disadvantaged. Secondly, you want to look at, as I said before, the time that you have remaining. It really is for you finishing up your dissertation work, and that's 1 to 2 years of research left at the time of the award. You cannot just apply for the postdoc portion. If you're applying for postdoc research, you really want to look at the F32. That would be the appropriate program to apply to, and each NIH institute runs those programs a little bit differently, so you'll want to research that. The other thing specific about this is that you have to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, and that's something that really holds for most of our training awards. Only the general K99 would be something that you could apply to as a non-citizen. In terms of another question that we often get is, if I have an F31 award, am I still eligible for the F99 K00? And you certainly are. The thing that would happen is, if you were successful and you got the F99, you would just end the F31. Also, people with diversity supplements are eligible to apply as well. The thing that would take you out of eligibility would be if you are in a clinical or some type of health professional dual degree program, such as an MD, PhD, where really the timing for this, it should be seamless between you going to the F99 to the K00, and most of those training programs, you would have to do some type of internship, or there would be a break, and therefore you would not be eligible for this particular award. And then finally, as we've already discussed, you must have mission relevance to one of the neuroscience institutes listed in the FOA, but the good news is that this is pretty broad-based neuroscience, and so hopefully, as long as you have a neuroscience focus, you should be able to find a fit. Today, we're going to, as Lauren already mentioned, people that have been successful in applying for and receiving this D-SPAN award are going to tell you a little bit more about the program itself, especially from their perspective. It's a great value to hear more from the outside world in terms of how to put these together versus just the NIH perspective. But in addition to what we're doing today, please know that we have a bunch of other resources. We have a former webinar where it really takes you through the mechanics of the FOA itself. We have a tip sheet for how to put together a strong F99 K00, and that tip sheet is based on some of the weaknesses that we found in the summary statements. And then we always like to give a nice shout out for our Building Up the Nerve podcast that will not only help you with the D-SPAN award, but just in general, learning about from the process of thinking about a research training application all the way to what happens when it goes to review and what happens if and when it is awarded. So these are all resources that you'll want to keep in mind as you think about potentially applying for this award. And then finally, if you have specific questions, that is our job. That's what we're here for. We'd love to help you through this process and help you to become competitive for this wonderful, wonderful mechanism. And so now I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
Hi. Next up, we have Dr. Stephanie Noble, who's going to take you through her D-SPAN journey.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie. I'm glad you all joined us today. My focus right now is in FMI methods development, and I tried a few things before I came here. So I started as a chemical and biological engineer at Princeton, focusing on protein modeling. Then I co-founded EEG neurofeedback company, Go Blue Labs. Then I did my PhD at the INP at Yale with Todd Constable, evaluating reliability and validity of FMI methods. And now I'm doing my postdoc also at Yale in radiology and biomedical imaging with Dustin. And here I'm kind of shifting from evaluating FMI methods to actually creating some of my own. So we were asked to share some of our top tips with you guys, and I felt really passionate about sharing a little bit more of how you would conceptualize the training component of these awards. So this is the part that we tend to have the most questions about, but actually through writing the application, this is the part that I became, as you heard before, most passionate about. I felt like it was a really important opportunity to look at the bigger picture. So you can step back and think about what motivates you, where you want to be in 5 to 10 years, and really think of a roadmap of how you want to get there. You can more formally operationalize this in a gap-based analysis. So all those questions that I talked about before, this is how I would think about breaking them down for the application. So I start by identifying a long-term career goal. Where do I want to be in about 5 to 10 years? Then I identify gaps, what stands in the way between me and that goal. You don't have to think of this as failures. You can think of this as things that you need to complete your training. Because all of us have things that we haven't done yet that we really need to get to the next level. And then you think about how you'll go about filling those gaps. So I'll go into detail of how I address each of these points in my own training plan. So my long-term career goal was to do neuroimaging, statistical, and computational methodology development. That's more of the scientific goal. And then the professional goal, the professional context, was to be an independent researcher in a research-intensive university. Then I identified gaps. And you can see I really split this up into scientific and professional gaps that correspond to the two parts of my goal. So some scientific gaps were I was really interested in doing methodology development, but really in order to do this and make tools that are usable by people often in our field, they're encapsulated within a software. So I thought it would be very useful for me to have some software development background. I also wanted some more basic statistical theoretical background, like more probability theory. That was really helpful for a lot of things that I'm focusing on right now. And so that's just an example of some of my scientific gaps. And then some professional gaps. I had done some project management of my own projects, but I wanted to develop more independence from my mentors. I also had not ever done a job search at the faculty level, and I wanted to gain some training in those areas as well. So to address those gaps, I broke down three different categories of things that I could do. And this is actually fairly common in some of the training grants that I looked at different levels. So I broke it into personalized tutorials, that's like one-on-one tutorials, short informal coursework, and conferences, seminars, and workshops. So personalized tutorials, for instance, I wanted to set up one-on-one tutorials every other week with my primary mentor talking about basic principles of software development. Short informal coursework, for instance, our lab software is developed in JavaScript, our latest version, Bioimage Suite Web, developed in JavaScript. So I wanted to get some more of a foundation in JavaScript. I've worked with MATLAB and R, but I haven't really done a lot with JavaScript before. I also sought out some opportunities to do academic job search workshops at the Yale Center for Teaching and Learning. And a lot of universities will offer many different types of professional trainings that might be useful for you as you advance to the next level. And then the conferences, seminars, and workshops, those are things that you've already been going to or places that you think you would have an opportunity to network, to show your work, to learn more about other work. And I had several in my own field. And then there's a specific component of the F99, which is that AIM 3. That's the plan for a postdoc. So I thought of this. I approached this by first thinking about who I wanted to work with, who does work that specifically aligns with my long-term career goal and would help me fill those gaps, and how would I go about meeting them? How would I go about interacting with them and seeing whether they'd be a good fit? So I identified a list of people, and I identified some strategies such as networking at conferences, arranging for one-on-one on-site visits, et cetera. And I want to say for the whole training plan, I felt that and I think that I've heard from others as well, and by looking at other grants, specificity is really key. It's really helpful to see a really concrete plan, really detailed plan. For the tutorials, I wrote down that I would meet with somebody, every other week for an hour. It's really helpful to show the reviewers that you have thought about this in a lot of detail. And in practice, I know that NIH officials are aware that things evolve over time. A particular tutorial might be less appropriate for you when you actually solidify your K00. So if you propose something in your F99 and then you end up working with someone else for your postdoc, they understand that things might change. And it's just really helpful to have a detailed framework that you can go back to and make adjustments to. All right, so my second tip is that it's really useful to have as many example grant applications and reference letters to look at as possible. So for me, I looked at some NRSAs. I looked at some other grants that were not NIH that had training components, and some other grants that were NIH that had training components. It's just helpful to get a sense, especially if you haven't written an NIH grant application before, to have a sense of all the different components, what a biosketch might look like, just all those little details. And really a lot of questions will pop up over the course of your writing this application that just having a good example can really help answer those questions. And we also get a lot of questions about when you should start. I think that it's never too early to start planning for this award, even if you're more than 2 years before. It's helpful to just think of a timeline when you want to send in the application, what sort of pieces need to be in place for you to finish, how that might fit in with other commitments that you have, and really looping in your PI and your grants office as soon as possible is really helpful. They'll have a wealth of expertise that's really useful as you plan your application. All right, thanks guys. Feel free to reach out to me. We'll have contact info at the end.
Okay, our next speaker is Nadia Khan, who's a postdoc at Mount Sinai.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Nadia, and I hope to give you three important tips of preparing your F99 K00 application. So just to let you know, if there's anything I don't cover here, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm willing to share any of my application materials with you or answer any questions. So to begin with, I just wanted to give you a background of my own scientific interest and where my training comes from. So that way you can sort of understand how I've laid out my transition from the F to the K period. So in general, my scientific curiosity has always been trying to understand how the brain interprets experience, everyday experience, and translates this into circuit function and behavior. So my training prior to my PhD was mostly molecular biology, and I continued on that track in Dr. Avtar Rupra's lab at University of Wisconsin. And there I studied a model of acquired epilepsy where a type of transient experience, or in other words, seizures, occur. And really my aim with doing this PhD work was to understand how the brain is responding on a molecular level to this very sudden and physical experience. And so a lot of my work in my PhD involved understanding epigenetic changes, either through histone modifying enzymes or through histone modifications, and then understanding the output that this has on gene expression and how this affects disease progression. So all in all, my PhD training was very molecular biology focused and really stood in line with what I had been prepared for prior to graduate school. So where I am now is actually Mount Sinai in New York City in Dr. Tristan Schumann's lab. And I have now transitioned to no longer doing molecular biology, but rather doing mostly circuit function and behavior work. And so in Tristan's lab, we're primarily focused on identifying circuits that are responsible for causing seizures and memory impairments in epilepsy. This is a very important comorbidity that happens in epilepsy patients. So all in all, I've stayed in the same field, but now I look at this problem through a very different lens. Instead of looking on a very small scale level, I look at everything on a systems biology level. And so in my application, I talked about this transition, how I've only had molecular biology experience, and now I'm going to transition to a place where I can look at this question more on a surface level, using things like in vivo electrophysiology, in vivo calcium imaging, and then also just learning animal behavior assays. And so really the connection here between these two training periods, both the F and the K award, was that I hope to one day connect these two and be able to answer questions on a molecular to systems level. How does the brain translate things like trauma? That's primarily what I'm interested in now, is physical or social trauma. How does the brain translate trauma into changes in circuit function and behavior? And how can this cause long-term disease in the future? So my tip number one for preparing your application is to really take the opportunity to make this application a personal reflection of you and your goals. So I've spent the last two slides telling you my own personal story and what are my personal goals. And really my background was that molecular biology training, but however, now I've transitioned to a point where I'm trying to understand biology more on a systems and circuit and behavior level. And that's because I've identified critical gaps within myself. And more importantly, I've identified critical gaps in knowledge that I've noticed in my field where I've seen investigators not able to connect all the dots within a single lab. And so I want to really be the first person that can go from top to bottom and bottom up. So based on my background, I argued in my application, because I have this molecular biology background, and now I'm going to supplement it with this systems understanding, I am the most ideal candidate to receive this grant, and therefore can become a strong future neuroscience leader. So to give you an example of some of the things I mentioned in my AIM 3, sorry, if you can go back one slide. So this is just an example here. I argued I have a critical understanding of these molecular changes. However, I don't have this circuit function behavior. So therefore, I'm going to find a postdoc that specifically addresses these deficits. Okay, so my tip number 2 is to kind of goes along with tip number 1, but to be honest about your deficits. So what are some deficits that you have noticed in yourself as somebody who is trying to become a strong leader in neuroscience? What are some open holes in your training experience that you feel that you can improve as you transition into your postdoctoral period? And in writing your training plan, take the opportunity to break this down into different silos, whether it be technical, whether it be communication skills, whether it be writing skills, and really lay out, as Stephanie said, concrete plans for how your K00 is going to help you to address and fill these deficits. So to give you some examples from my own personal training plan, and these are actual examples, again, I mentioned I'm going to join a postdoc where I will learn about circuits and behavior, but also I talked about teaching, and part of the tenure review for becoming a faculty member is your performance in the classroom, and that's something that I did not have to do as a PhD student, did not have to teach a course. And so in my postdoc, I mentioned I wanted to teach a course to gain those skills. Communication skills as a rising leader in neuroscience, it's always important to have good written and oral communication skills. So I talked about very concrete examples how my goal is to write at least one grant per year. Even though I were to receive this grant, I still need to continuously work on communicating my ideas and making new experiments and figuring out the flow of experiments to finally bring something to fruition. And then also publish and present at least 2 times a year in conferences. And lastly, one of the things I mentioned as a rising trainee is that I've only mentored undergraduates up until this point. And so if I want to be a successful PI someday with my own lab who has graduate students, I need to have experience actually mentoring graduate students. And so I will find a lab that will allow me to actually mentor a graduate student through his or her project. Okay, my tip number 3 is work closely with your mentor to develop your application. And what I mean by this comes from my own personal experience. I was lucky to have a PI, Dr. Abtar Rupra, that has served on many study sections for NIH. And so when I initially let him know that I was going to apply for this grant, he actually sat me down and explained to me how study sections actually work. What is going to actually happen when I submit this application, and where will it go, and who will be reading it, and how will I be judged? And I thought that was really insightful for me starting to write my application, to know where it was going to go and how it was going to be read and how it was going to be judged. So my advice for you is that if your PI or a PI that you know of have served on a study section, ask them about what their experience is like as a study section member. What kind of insight do they have into an application that particularly stands out to the reviewing committee? What kind of concerns would a review committee automatically flag for concern about an applicant? In my case, one of the things I wish I could change about my application, now looking back on it now, is I would have gave a more strong argument for the case of if my lab were to lapse in funding, how would we address that, either through departmental funding or otherwise. Another could be that how can you communicate your research and your goals, your training goals, to a study section member who might not necessarily be in your field. So again, you want to be specific about what you're trying to achieve in becoming a rising leader in your field, but at the same time, that study section member might not be in your field, and so they might not be aware of the deficits or the background of the deficits that might exist. And so lastly, I'll give a plug here for Building Up the Nerve. If you are not familiar with how study section works, you can actually tune into this podcast and there are episodes about it, and you can learn more about it. And lastly, one piece of advice is to make sure that your training plan reflects what your PI's plan is for you in your sponsor statement. So these two pieces of work should communicate back and forth to each other and should reflect the same ideas and the same goals for you and your training. And so if you work closely with your mentor and you share your documents back and forth, this will become really easy for you to do when submitting your application. So lastly, I just want to say, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. I'm really happy to help you. There's my Twitter handle there. You can message me at any time if you have a really quick question or if you are just needing a really quick piece of advice about something, some clarity, or you can email me directly at my Gmail address right there.
Okay, thank you so much, Nadia. Next up, we're going to hear from Nate Harnett, who is a postdoc at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for having me, and thank you so much, Dr. Michelle-Jones-London. And thank you all for attending the webinar today and letting me share a little bit about my experience. So I'm going to build a little bit off of what Stephanie and Nadia have already talked about, and talk about a few pieces of advice that really helped me when I was putting together my F99 K00 application. But before I do that, I just wanted to walk through a little bit about my background and give a little insight into what my foundation was when I was applying as an applicant, just to give people an idea, of what one potential applicant might look like. So I came from a small liberal arts college where I studied psychology and did some undergraduate research on emotional memory and psychophysiology. And after that, I moved to the University of Alabama at Birmingham to finish my PhD in psychology. As part of the behavioral neuroscience program, I got a foundation in different types of magnetic resonance imaging modalities and started to build a foundation, a background in the neural substrates of human fear learning. And so now I'm a postdoc in the Ressler Neurobiology of Fear Lab at McLean Hospital, where my research is really focused on the neurobiological substrates of trauma and stress disorder susceptibility. Or to put that in sort of different terms, using pretty brain pictures to try and understand if someone's going to develop PTSD after experiencing a traumatic event. And so when I applied for the F99, I was fortunate enough to be in the first cohort of D-SPAN. So I got to submit my application when the funding opportunity was first announced and was able to put my application in and was fortunate enough to get it. A couple strengths that I had as an applicant was that I had a few original research publications based on my graduate work, and I had some success with gaining funding from internal and external fellowships around UAB. But one thing I did want to highlight, though, is that as much as I had some success as an applicant, I had some failures as well. So I had applied a couple of times for NSF fellowships, didn't get them, applied for an HHMI fellowship, didn't get it, had applied and reapplied for an F31 NRSA, also, didn't get that either. So I wasn't entirely batting 1,000 when I was going for the F99, but from those prior rejections and from some of the successes I had, I was able to develop a few basic tenets that I think really helped me put together a really strong F99. And that's what I want to just talk about briefly today. And so the first thing that I found really helpful was really trying to understand the review criteria for the application. The nice thing about the funding opportunity is if you go online right now and you type in D-SPAN F99, you can pull up the funding opportunity, and about halfway down, there's going to be the application review information. And will give you the set of criteria that's going to be used to evaluate the application, which means that you have an opportunity when you're drafting your training plan, when you're drafting your aims, to really look and ask yourself, how is what you're writing related to the specific criteria that you're going to be evaluated on? And you can do that for basically every single section of the application. And doing that allows you to craft your application in a way that is really strong, because you know already what people are going to be evaluating you based on. And then you can go and do similar drafts given, how little space you have when you're writing these different sections to say, what I've written, can I make it clearer? Can I cut things? Can I add things so that's very clear what criteria I'm addressing? And that helps to add to the strength of your application. Related to that, and related to a lot of things that Stephanie and Nadia have already talked about, is that it's really important to connect the dots for your reviewers. We work in very highly specialized fields. We have certain ways of saying things and certain ways of wording things. And when we write, we're so used to having the idea in our head that we might write it down a certain way that makes perfect sense for us, but might not make sense for the people that are reviewing it or for people that are reading it for the first time. And so it's really important to make sure that you connect your ideas very logically and linearly so that it makes sense for other people. So Stephanie mentioned, and Nadia mentioned as well, trying to identify gaps that they wanted to address, certain goals that they wanted to achieve, and then made very specific steps about how they would go achieve that. So Stephanie mentioned getting training in JavaScript, getting training in conducting job searches and applying for different things. Nadia mentioned trying to move from molecular biology to electrophys. And by having these specific goals or these overall goals and then setting specific steps, it really helps flesh out and make it clear how you're going to move from one step to the other so that you can accomplish your overall goal. And that, again, just helps make the application quite a bit stronger and demonstrates that you have a training plan in mind that is very strong and tight. And sort of the final tip that I wanted to give was to really leverage your networking village, or sorry, your mentoring village and your network. As Stephanie and Nadia mentioned, it's really important to get feedback from your PI and from your lab pretty much the second you decide to start writing it. But other individuals, things like your graduate colleagues or actual or potential co-sponsors, would also be good people to read this because they can give you insight into your narrative, into clarity that might not be the same advice that you get from your PI. So for example, when I wrote my training plan, it was primarily geared towards neuroimaging training. I still had people who did cell and molecular biology, who looked at animal models of psychiatric disorders, to look at it and read through it and see, when you read this outside of a neuroimaging field, are you able to follow the steps that I'm laying out? Is this something that makes you excited? And can you find a gap in what I'm trying to say that might be something that a reviewer might ask? And in doing that, I actually came across another co-sponsor for my grant that really helped the training plan and the application be that much stronger. Another reason to leverage your network is that, at this point with people who've applied before, they might be willing to share copies of their applications or their actual summary statements that'll help you figure out what are some things that really work well in applications, what are some things that might be able to improve upon. And those are all things that you can use when you're drafting to help make sure that you're putting out the best possible application for you. So I'm going to end there. I have my Twitter and Gmail at the bottom. Please feel free to contact me if there's any questions or if you want me to share my application with you. And thank you guys so much for your attention today.
Thank you, Nate. Okay, our last speaker is Alberto Lopez, who is currently a postdoc fellow at Vanderbilt. Take it away.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, NINDS, for hosting us. So just to start, I'm going to give a little bit of my background and how I got to where I am now in terms of, or at least where I was when I applied, and really what did I do to position myself to be a successful applicant. And so my previous training was at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So I did my undergraduate work at Duke, and then I worked for Tom Cash at UNC, and then did my PhD work with Marcelo Wood at UC Irvine. And then now I'm at Vanderbilt with Aaron Calipari as a postdoc. And I was fortunate enough to be in the first cohort. Kind of the downside of that is I didn't really get the luxury of choosing when I applied. I kind of was, this is the timeline, and so hopefully I get this one shot, and hopefully it lands. And so at the bottom, you can see my general timeline of when I applied. So it was announced in February. And I actually dug up some old emails from when I was in graduate school and found that I submitted my first draft to my PI that first week of March with an April submission deadline. And so that's kind of the first tip I have is give yourself plenty of time to write. So that was about a month and a half of writing. But more importantly, give yourself time not to write. So give yourself time to step away from the documents, think about your project, think about what your career goals are, to then really get back to it and submit a strong application. And so then submitted in April, I was funded in August, and then transitioned to the K00 June of the next year. And so really how you want to approach the specific aims is use your aims and use your application as a way of showing how you develop as a scientist and how you are able to develop a project. So in specific aim 1, you want to talk about the things you've done, how did you build your dissertation work, what have you done to answer the research questions you want to answer. And in specific aim 2, you're going to transition that to what do you have left. But it's really important to emphasize not just the kind of experiments you've done and have left to do, but the kind of career training and the career development you've gotten in graduate school. How have you taken advantage of your environment to move from a first-year graduate student to a really confident, really strong PhD candidate? And so in specific aim 2, the kind of tip I would give is be realistic about your timeline in terms of the research you have and the timeline you're proposing to do it in. So with my PI, we kind of had a back and forth of I had a few side projects that really weren't important to my dissertation questions. And so I had to be honest with him and say, those are great questions. Those are great questions for another graduate student to answer. I really want to focus here on the important questions left in my dissertation. And also on top of that, I want to focus on the career training I have to do. So I have to go to a couple more conferences. I want to attend a Cold Spring Harbor course. So really try to be realistic about what it is you think you can get done in the time period you're proposing to do. And so for specific aim 3, the way I approach it is really similar to how everyone else has, Stephanie, Nate, and Nadia, in really identify your needs as a trainee. So, at this point I had done work with Tom Cash at UNC Chapel Hill, where it was using basic behavioral assays to really see what circuits contribute to different anxiety-like behaviors. And so at that point, I knew how to use optogenetics and chemogenetics. Transitioning to Marcelo's lab, I really started focusing in on addiction-specific behaviors, but they're still relatively simple tasks like CPP sensitization. But really, I learned these complex molecular assays. And so my overall research question as a graduate student, as a postdoc, and hopefully as a faculty member is identifying the epigenetic mechanisms that control circuit function in substance use disorder. And so when I was putting my application together, I really, the same way everyone else approached this, try to fill the gaps of that is where I want to be, here's where I am now, and what are the things I need to do to get from A to B. And so from an experimental standpoint, I knew I needed stronger behavioral models in my postdoctoral training, so things like self-administration. And to really link epigenetic function to circuit function, I needed to kind of build that toolkit in terms of the in vivo circuit monitoring, so things like fast scan, cyclical voltammetry, or fiber photometry. But again, it's really important that you don't just focus on the kind of experimental or scientific development that you need, but the career training that you're going to look for in the postdoc phase. And so at this point, like Nadia, I had only ever really mentored undergraduates, so I was really looking for the kind of next step in mentorship, mentoring graduate students. But then also in my postdoc, in aim 3, I talked about the kind of career training I'm going to need in my postdoc to be able to make the next step. So things like continuing teaching, gaining teaching experience, more mentorship, grant writing. It's really important to not just focus on the kind of scientific question, but really focus on how you as a scientist and all-around scientist are going to develop into a faculty member. And so kind of my take-home messages are, first, use each component of your application to demonstrate your development. So, for me, I even asked my reference writers to kind of help me with that. So when I asked one of my reference writers to write me a letter, they said, sure, and then they asked me, what do you want me to write about? And at this point in my career, I had never even considered that that was something I should think about. But it was a really good opportunity because this faculty member had been on my committee since my first year of graduate school. I'm now fourth year. And so they've really seen how I've developed, taken the steps through graduate school to become a competitive scientist. And so I asked them to emphasize, how did you view my career development? How have I built this project from the ground up? So the next kind of take-home message is the same way Stephanie talked about. You need to take a step back and evaluate your career goals and the best way to get there. The third is give yourself time to write and take a break from writing. Scientific writing is a process, and if you try to rush it, it will definitely reflect in the results. And then always be willing to reach out to D-SPAN fellows. In academia, we're kind of conditioned to think that funding opportunities is more of a gauntlet, and I got to do what I got to do to get there. But the D-SPAN community is so welcoming. I have nothing but positive things to say both about NINDS and the fellows themselves. Always willing to help, always there to help with application materials or advice. And don't be discouraged by previous results. If I were to show my OneDrive folder of failed applications versus funded applications, my failed applications are exponentially larger than the funded. But you really just have to keep trying to get that funding, and don't let previous rejections stop you from putting in an application. So with that, I'll send it back to Lauren.
Okay, thank you to our speakers for sharing their experiences and expertise now in applying for these awards. We have about 20 minutes for question and answer session. So if you have any questions, be sure to type them into the Q&A box in the WebEx, and we'll get started. So we've had a couple of questions about the AIM-3 and the postdoc plan. So does one of you want to talk about how strictly do you need to adhere to the proposed postdoc plan? So did any of you change things or do things differently than you had outlined in the AIM-3?
I guess I could chime in for this one. This is Nadia here. So initially my F99 application, my AIM-3 actually talked about investigating the overlap between Alzheimer's disease and epilepsy. So there's this kind of emerging field within epilepsy that patients with Alzheimer's disease also have epileptic seizures, and when they do, they have a faster cognitive decline. And so there's a couple investigators that are interested in understanding sort of a chicken or the egg question, which came first, the seizures or Alzheimer's disease, or did Alzheimer's disease cause the epileptic seizures? All in all, that's what I discussed for my AIM-3. And again, still on the circuit level, as I spoke about, finding those labs that would give me the experience on a circuit level. But for this particular research question, and now, as you saw from my slides, I'm actually not in an AD epilepsy lab, although Tristan's lab does do some of that work. I'm not involved in that. Rather, I'm more focused on memory and understanding how epileptic seizures disrupt memory. So I definitely switched compared to what I wrote, and it's okay. Really, you can think about the F99 K00 funding you as an applicant and your career trajectory, and less about the science.
Yeah, and this is Michelle, I'll just chime in that we're really using AIM-3 to think or to see how you think as a researcher and a scientist. And so while we do require a level of detail in terms of broad strokes of where you see yourself going, and you are in the last 1 to 2 years of your graduate work, so you should have some type of idea. We realize that you haven't actually interviewed yet for your postdoc positions, and that it's very normal to go from graduate school to postdoc doing something different, as long as you're still taking advantage of your skills and your strengths and creating a win-win for the postdoc environment. We're very open. The only stipulation, once again, is it still has to be within the scope of neuroscience. So don't feel that if you're applying to the D-SPAN and you write something for AIM-3 that you're locked in. You do have that freedom to explore.
Another question that we have here is, did any of you include a co-sponsor in your application, and how did you integrate that person into your application if you did?
I can chime in. This is Nate, just a little bit. I think included 3 separate co-sponsors. And the reason for that on my end was I wanted to build sort of a set of multimodal neuroimaging technique skills and expertise. And my PI was clearly great with one of them, but sort of dabbling his toe in the other 2. And so we chose a couple people who had demonstrable experience in these different MR modalities to make it clear that there are people at my institution and trainings that I'm willing to go through so I can actually learn the skills that I need to learn. And I also included another co-sponsor who helped develop our mentorship plan. We had a specific section towards identifying mentorship and training issues more commonly faced by underrepresented minority students. And so we had worked together to figure out how can I work with her to develop those skills and that background and knowledge about issues that I might face transitioning to postdoc that would be really helpful. So I think for me, it was helpful in terms of trying to get people together so that I could have a very formal and deep training plan. And that would be why I chose that many.
I'll say
Thank
I
you.
also included
Alberto.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Alberto.
Stephanie, you can, okay, thanks. Sorry. I didn't include co-sponsors, but I got letters of support from other faculty at UC Irvine that would help me help me get some training to finish my dissertation work, but then also prepare me for the kind of work I was proposing for my postdoc. So I had a letter of support from a statistician on campus who would help me with the bioinformatics for doing some of the sequencing analysis that I was proposing. I had a letter of support from another molecular biologist who was going to help me develop some of the techniques that I was going to carry into my postdoc. So that's another way of getting kind of support from your local network without necessarily putting them down as a co-sponsor.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, it seems like if you can have someone speak to any sort of skills that you have in detail in a positive way, that your PI doesn't have one-on-one, as much one-on-one experience with you about, it seems like it would only be a positive for your grant. I had a co-sponsor who I had worked with one-on-one for a lot of technical development stuff. And I had them speak to my programming abilities, my ability to pick up new languages, my ability to kind of manage my own work by myself, my motivation and stuff. So I think that was very helpful too, because that's the sort of detail that's sort of daily interaction with this person that I didn't necessarily have with my PI. And both were very useful, both were very useful perspectives in supporting me. My PI talked more about my ability to relate my work to the big picture, my ability to think scientifically about my work, and then this co-sponsor talked about my ability to grow technically, my ability to develop my technical skills.
Great, thank you all. So we've had a couple of questions about first author publications. So is it necessary to have a first author publication by the time you apply? So Michelle, do you want to address that?
Yeah, what I'll say is that we get this question a lot with all of our training mechanisms, and we kind of call this like the Goldilocks question in terms of what's the right number of publications. We certainly have had D-SPAN awards funded that the person did not have a first author publication, and what was shown was a history and a track record of productivity, and for most of those, there was some evidence why the person had not published. Maybe they were in a research area or using a tool or, knockout mice, and it made sense that if they were doing that type of research, they were probably saving, the papers towards the end, or that timeline fit. And what you had was evidence of the mentors and others involved in the project talking about the productivity of that person, talking about the plans and the timeline for the publication, and the fact that it just hadn't happened yet, but that there were plans and formats were being put into their training plan to make sure that they left with the first author publications. But reviewers will look at this, and there have been several conversations in different camps on this. So it's important to be sure that if you do not currently have that first author publication, and there are solid reasons why, and you and your mentor both can demonstrate that productivity, I wouldn't count this out as a mechanism, but make sure that you have those conversations in the training plan and in the application. And now I'll have our scientific review officer chime in from his point of view of what he's seen in terms of the conversations.
Yeah, Michelle covered probably most everything that I would want to say, but I think if you have a good explanation of what you've been doing and plans for what you have publications or papers and in preparation, that you just clearly state all that, and it's helpful if your mentor also addresses that as well. Some reviewers get hung up on that, and we try to avoid people that are very stubborn in one way or the other, but you never know when someone's going to, be concerned about that. So it's well worth addressing if you don't have any first author publications already.
Yeah, and I'll also add, it's really important. I think the ones that are really concerning is if you don't have first author publications, and then there's also not a sign that you're actually going to outside meetings and conferences and talking about your science. That's sort of the kiss of death. You want to make sure that you, in terms of that evidence of productivity and evidence of you really having your research reviewed in the scientific community and among your peers, you can also highlight your speaking engagement, scientific conferences, abstracts, those things as well. They won't count, obviously, the same as a peer-reviewed publication, but that is also evidence of you, at least having your science out there in the broader community.
Do any of our speakers want to talk about how they demonstrated productivity outside of papers?
Hi, this is Nadia. I guess I will speak from the underdog. I didn't have a first author paper applying to this grant mechanism, and I still got it. So there's hope for you if you're one of those people. I think I will echo similar to what Michelle said, is that if you address why you have not had that paper, either in the sense of like maybe the model that you're working with, or you had to establish a particular technique in your lab prior to starting your experiments, that really helps the reviewers understand where you're coming from. So in my particular case, I had to establish the model in my lab before I even started collecting the data, and that took me almost 2 years. And then I used a drug to inhibit this epigenetic histone modifying enzyme, and that took a while for me to find the right conditions, the right drug, the right vehicle for the drug. And so I explained part of that in my application as well. So I wouldn't say like let it be your end all be all, you'll never get it, but definitely be, like I said in my tip number 2, be honest about your deficits. And if you're honest about your deficits and you address them, you leave no room for that reviewer committee to have any doubts about you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this is Bill Benzin again. And yeah, if you have a good track record of presenting talks and abstracts and showing that you're actively engaged, that helps a lot, especially if you're doing a type of science, or you're doing techniques which may require a while before you can get that first author publication. I know Michelle alluded to that, but having that documented in there is very helpful.
Great. And I think this will probably be our last question. We have a question about how the D-SPAN Award has benefited you in terms of your future academic career potential. So I was wondering if each of you could sort of talk about the benefits that have flown from getting the award.
I can go first.
Hello?
Hello?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
my audio kind of freaked out. So for me, I mean, first off, you become incredibly competitive as a postdoc candidate. You are essentially a pre-postdoc because you come with your own funding right out of the gate. But aside from just the kind of money for money's sake, you are competitive because you're demonstrating your ability to get funding and your ability to develop a project and convey that to people outside of your field. And so not only is it impressive to be a postdoc with your own funding in and of itself, but you're demonstrating to potential postdoc mentors, I know what I'm doing when it comes to building a project. I know what I'm doing when it comes to writing grants and presenting it to other people. So it's a reflection of the caliber of graduate student that you are. So definitely it's been a huge benefit for me. It also has given me a little bit of the freedom to explore some more risky projects or experiments in my postdoc, knowing that I don't necessarily have the clock ticking of trying to get an F32, knowing that I have 4 years to really build a solid research program, I can take a little bit more risk.
Yeah, I would add to that, Alberto. I think that I completely agree with what he said about this making you a very competitive candidate in the postdoc pool. If you come in with funding, it's such a big advantage compared to other people. You might be able to even join a lab that doesn't have funds for a postdoc or has little funds for a postdoc. And I think adding to that, having this dedicated funding gives you a lot of protected time to do the research that you proposed. You're not necessarily coming into someone's lab, being their postdoc and doing the work that they want you to do as much. You really have a lot of protection for your own work. I also say the D-SPAN community is really fantastic. There are a lot of people with a lot of fantastic expertise at all levels. And the D-SPAN, also the other D-SPAN community, the K99 to R00 community is pretty great, or the other brain community. There's just a lot of people who are really willing to share their expertise, willing to share their grant awards, advice. And you get to meet with them at the SFN, at SFN and other conferences dedicated for the field. I also think that it's important to have a demonstrated record of funding for promotion as a faculty member. And this is just, it's showing that you've already been able to have that funding really early in your faculty career. And I think that that's also very important.
Yeah, this is Nate.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, Nadia, did you want to go?
No, go ahead, Nate.
Great. Always the wonderfulness of webinar. So I just want to echo quickly what Stephanie and Alberto already said, which is having a demonstrable track record of funding has been great for me in terms of applying for other things like travel awards to different conferences, in terms of having a conversational point for different people, both at my institution and institutions that I've been visiting for conferences and things like that. That's a really helpful talking point just in terms of networking. It's very impressive to have a mechanism like this under your belt. I mean, I think we can all agree that this is a very impressive and phenomenal opportunity for people. So when you explain what you actually have, that impresses people. And of course, as I already said, just having, postdoctoral funding under your belt is really good for trying to find a lab that you're going to fit very well with. And I think, for me, some of the best parts have been actually being a part of the D-SPAN network. So Stephanie is actually part of a monthly mentorship group we have with myself, her, and a couple other D-SPAN people, and we get to talk about how are things going, what are some advice that we have for people, and be able to communicate and network that way, and that's been really helpful. And so it's hard to find like one or two things that have been great about D-SPAN, but just in terms of the networking opportunities alone, getting the F99 K00 has been phenomenal.
Hi there, Nadia here. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Nadia, you go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. I'll make it quick. The D-SPAN has been, for me, like really helpful in, I would say, 3 major ways. A first way was similar to Nate. I applied to a bunch of fellowships throughout graduate school that I didn't receive, some of them being NSF, some of them being HHMI, Gilliam Fellows. And so towards the end of my graduate career, I felt like maybe I'm just not cut out for this. And so getting this fellowship really like put a huge confidence boost in myself that, hey, I think you might actually have some good ideas here. And people will actually also think you have good ideas. So you can think of it as, it's a way for you to take a step back, look at yourself, and put your ideas out there. And if you happen to get it, then it might be something that will help propel you to the next step and give you confidence that, yes, I belong here, and yes, I can do this. Number 2 is with interviewing for postdocs. I came from a very small lab. And so to have the bigger labs sort of know who I am and notice who I am, having this funding really helped, especially when I went to a conference and one of the section leaders put that like on my introduction slide, P.S. she has funding. That really helped to like bring all the eyes and attention to me. And I would have not otherwise had that had I not had this funding mechanism. And then lastly, the network again of D-SPAN is amazing. Everyone in this fellowship program, they're extremely talented and so intelligent that you will be floored like where they go and what they do and what they accomplish. And it's just really good to be part of that community and learn from others, like what they're doing and how they're doing it. And everyone in D-SPAN is so welcoming and very nice and easy to approach.
Well, I was going to say something, but I think you guys have said it all. I mean, but we've talked a lot about what the award confers in terms of, the advantage to people that would hire you. But really, you should see it as it is also your golden ticket. It is really empowers the awardee to get the mentorship that they deserve, right? And it also allows you to, as you're looking for this postdoc, there will be things that are required in terms of the mentorship and training that NIH outlines in the terms and agreement. And so you can make us the bad guy in terms of asking for things that perhaps maybe you would be too shy to ask for, or just making sure that you're asking for things in black and white that maybe you would have assumed. We really want it written out, and that's another benefit of the mechanism, that it really puts you in the driver's seat of really getting the training and the mentorship that you deserve. We really see the D-SPANers as the next generation of future leaders in neuroscience. And so that to us is something that we take seriously when someone receives this award. And hopefully you listening on the call can see yourself in this community, and knowing that obviously not everyone who applies will be funded, knowing that there are other NIH mechanisms as well. If this if this isn't your shot, or maybe in terms of the timing, you don't have time to reapply, because that's the other thing. If you don't get it on the first shot, that happens to plenty of people as well. If you have the timing, reapply. And if, you know, for some reason you time out, then still reaching out to any one of us on this slide that you see for contact, especially the NIH staff. We will get you to the next part. Like I said, it could be an F32, or in some cases there could be other awards that may bridge that gap. So just talking to us is something that you also want to get out of this webinar.
All right, well, we're out of time. And so I just want to say thank you again so much to our speakers for taking the time to share their wisdom today. And if your question was not answered, please, as Michelle said, email us, reach out. We're very approachable. We will answer your question. And we want as many of you to succeed as possible. So definitely reach out. And the webinar slides and recording will be posted in a few weeks. Bye-bye.